student leaders would like to thank Governor Malloy and Superintendent Dr. Torres Rodriguez for joining us today. Thank you, Ms. Biggs, Ms. Salama, Ms. Norman, Mr. Wan, Mr. Leonard, Mr. Franklin, and teachers supporting us here today.
The students here at HMTCA, along with other public schools in and outside of the Hartford district, have experienced a loss in resources, including security guards. When I was here in 6th grade, there was 600 students and 3 security guards for us. Currently, we have 1,050 students here at HMTCA and still only have 3 security guards. Just to give you an idea, that is 1 security guard for every 350 students. I'd like to ask the governor and the superintendent, how are we supposed to support and protect a school where there are only 3 trained security guards for 1,000 students?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me here. When I think about the current process in which we're in as a school district, we're in the middle of our budget development process, and while we acknowledge that security guards are key to the safety of our schools, I also want us to consider and take a step back and think of the fact that we all own school safety and school security. And so in addition to having the necessary security guards that all of our schools need, making sure that we all acknowledge what it is to have a safe culture and climate in our school. One of our priorities is to improve culture and climate, and that means ensuring that each student feels safe and valued. And so all of the adults and all of the students take part in that process.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. Actually, to be back on your campus for the second time in a relatively short period of time. Let me say how impressed I am with your student leaders, all of the faculty members and the principal, and I'm certainly happy to be here with the superintendent. But you asked a very specific question, and the reality is that those are locally made decisions by school administrators in each of the cities and towns. We have 164 school districts that serve 169 cities and towns. So how they spend their money ultimately is up to them. Having said that, one of the things that I am very proud of having done and will continue to do as long as I'm governor is argue that urban school systems need additional funding. And that's actually been provided while I've been governor, not to the extent that I would like it to be, but we have increased funding to urban school districts. In fact, we highlight 30 school districts in particular for additional spending. And then ultimately, let me say this about your security here. The state of Connecticut has also authorized already $51 million in additional security construction, design, and systems. And in February, we authorized another round of such funding. Now, that's not all that's being spent to make buildings more secure, because every one of those dollars is matched to some extent by local dollars that are also being spent. I think since Columbine, since the attacks that played themselves out in Washington, New York, and in Pennsylvania, and since what happened in a school in Connecticut, we've had a much stronger focus. For instance, when I was growing up, which is a long time ago, I will admit, we might have a fire drill, but there was never any discussion about what you would do if guns were heard being shot, and even in the area of the school. No one rehearsed or practiced what you would do in those circumstances. We've come a long way in understanding the dangers of living in a society where guns are not just prevalent, but too prevalent. There are too many guns available to the wrong folks. And then I just want to join the superintendent's comments, if Until relatively recently, students weren't told that they owned their own security. This was a top-down discussion. And until relatively recently, people didn't have discussions about other people's mental health capacities or dangers. And until recently, people didn't talk about what warning signs were. And that is a very different situation today as a result of the efforts in individual school districts and the efforts by the state. We are, in fact, increasing spending in school districts, in particularly the 30 urban or poorer school districts, on that issue in particular as well.
Due to budget cuts at schools across the state, it has resulted in large class sizes. As a result, it creates this ongoing cycle where students are not receiving the help they need. This includes mental illness, as schools do not have enough resources to treat every child. Our question for both the superintendent and the governor is, schools play a huge role in identifying if a child has a mental illness, suffering from depression, or is just having a bad day. How can schools ensure that every child is carefully observed and receives one-on-one attention? How can we work this into our budget?
Great question, Alexa. And, you referenced mental health, and I'm going to ask that we step back and just talk about just developmental health. I know that mental health is an area in which all of us have to continue to learn more about in terms of how we respond, how it affects us, how it might affect our community. But there's the normal developmental processes of young adolescents, and which is why it's so important for us to, through our conversations and our curriculum, what we are teaching, the conversations that you as peers are having, that we understand what those signs are, whether they relate to mental health or just everyday development and the challenges that you as adolescents, if you will, in an urban setting can experience. And so additional conversations, Alexa, but also empowering our staff. Empowering, I mean, with knowledge and skills to identify those warning signs and then to be able to connect with the appropriate resources. Yes, I would like to have as many mental health professionals as we can in all of our schools. However, we know that learning just doesn't happen in school. Learning for all of the youth also extends beyond the school doors. And such, it is important for us to engage all of our community stakeholders, from our community-based providers, from our higher ed institutions, and our faith-based leaders, which is something that we, certainly under my administration, are really intentional about bringing in the community into our schools as well.
At Columbine, at Sandy Hook School in Newtown, in Connecticut, and the most recent school shooting in Florida that really sparked this movement, and I want to thank all of you for being leaders in this movement. In each one of those cases, the assailant or assailants were recognized as people having difficulty, isolated, mental health challenges, were previously identified in the Florida case as a danger, specifically as a danger. And I think that you're hitting on an important topic, and that is, when we have identified someone as a particular challenge, how do we handle it? And quite frankly, I think the answer to that is that's evolving, but evolving rapidly. Interventions are necessary. Now, back in the 90s, Connecticut passed a law that allows a process to remove guns from individuals who are so recognized or identified. And we have used that successfully. But in Adam Lanza's case, the mother chose not to pursue, and there was no financial problem, treatment for her son. And she thought this having guns was a form of therapy, if you will, which of course, I think everyone in this classroom, in this room would say is probably not the right therapy to be engaged in. I think that making sure that professionals in school buildings have the skill set, the tools, and that also means the appropriate budgetary items to do a better job. And I think that we have to be engaged in ongoing training. I think social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, guidance counselors, and principals and assistant principals, as well as faculty members, and other members of the staff have to all be engaged, cross-trained to recognize and understand what their obligations are to respond. So hopefully we're doing a better job than we have before, and undoubtedly we're not doing a perfect job. Again, I do also want to make one other point. There are districts that are very well funded, and they're not necessarily doing a better job than Hartford. I think Hartford is not as well funded as I would have it be, but has done really quite an extraordinary job. Crime is down, school-based crime is down very substantially. Youth coming into the corrections department or the court system is down very substantially. That includes down very substantially in Hartford. We are doing something right to bring about a 63–64% reduction in young people being involved with our corrections department. That needs to continue, and we need to make more progress.
Hi, I'm John. I'm an 8th grader here at HMTCA. I don't feel comfortable with teachers carrying firearms because there are still a risk, even with teachers trained. It's too much responsibility and not their job to be the police. I think security officers should carry firearms because they are the ones responsible for protecting the school. However, it's important that they receive the proper training to carry a firearm. What is your stance with teachers and security officers carrying a firearm on the school?
I'm not in favor of teachers carrying firearms in schools or defining a teacher's role that's being involved in that level or that form of security. I think that that's a non-starter. It presents great danger. About a month and a half ago, a teacher who had a gun in a school system where that was allowed, that gun went off, actually struck a student in the neck. That student went home, disclosed that to his parents. He was taken to the hospital, and they actually had shrapnel in his neck. And by the way, that happens more often than you think. I'll give you, I have state troopers who are with me a lot. These are people who are trained extensively over a 6-month period to be a trooper. And then they have to be recertified in using their guns properly on a regular basis and receive additional training as a part of that. The system that President Trump has talked about and that exists in some states doesn't require any of that. You basically have to have if your state requires a permit, you have to have a permit to have the gun. If the state doesn't even require a permit, you have to have taken, a gun safety exercise. It just doesn't make sense. With respect to security personnel and police officers most particularly, part of a police officer's equipment is a gun, and if they're in a school, I've always believed that they should be wearing their uniform and their equipment. With respect to other security personnel, if they're properly trained, if they're properly certified on an ongoing basis, that may make sense, and I wouldn't have a problem with it. But lack of certification, lack of training initially, and lack of ongoing training would be a block to that.
So wholeheartedly wholeheartedly opposed to our teachers bearing arms. When I think of, maybe it was 2 to 3 months ago when we had our colleagues from the Hartford Police Department talk to us about shooters and intruders in the building, and they referenced the fact that, physically, you have to have a certain amount of weight in order to be able to manage and handle a firearm. And so I put myself, right, in the shoes of so I'm a teacher and I'm bearing an arm, and what that would do to I barely weigh 110 pounds, right? So that's one piece of it. But then it's the other piece, which, the governor alluded to. It's teachers are experts in content, pedagogy, assessment, right? So I want our teachers to be experts in what they were trained to do. And so I don't want to pile on an added need to have to train them and an added stress, if you will. And so that is not what I believe the answer to be in order to keep our schools safe. I think it's completely much broader than that. And I want to continue to empower our teachers with the skills and the knowledge base in order to improve outcomes for our students. I don't believe that firearms are the answer to do that. I also, I'm thankful for the partnership that we have with our first responders. And, Hartford Police Department is an extension of who we are, if you will, at the district. And so constantly reviewing and improving our practices. And so I know that we can continue to count on our first responders and those partnerships to improve our practice. I do not believe that firearms for our teachers is the answer.
Yeah, Superintendent, not everyone who is not in education is used to using the word pedagogy. Do you want to take a moment?
So teachers, you are experts in the content, which is what you teach, right? What you teach, pedagogy, how you teach and assessment, how it is that we determine whether our students are learning what you are teaching them. And so that is what I want to continue to empower our teachers with.
Good morning. My name is Malloy, and I'm an advocate of gun reform. And as you know, students around the country are mobilizing to bring awareness to the issue of gun reform. Students are coming to us and asking how they can get officials' attention. So my question is, as community leaders, what gets your attention the most? Walkouts, petitions, letters?
It's a great question. I think that in the issue of guns, if I can just get to that directly, Connecticut has some of the strictest, if not the strictest, gun laws in the nation, and I believe by the end of the first week of, or the start of the second week of May, we will have even stronger laws, because by then we will have outlawed gun stocks and other mechanisms to make guns fire as if they were fully automatic weapons. That's passed some initial votes, and I think it will be in fact approved, and then I'll be able to sign it. But our biggest problem in Connecticut when it comes to guns is not the guns that are sold within the state for the most part, but guns that are coming into our state from other states that don't have the kinds of laws that we have. And specifically, I'm talking about southern states and western states where a large percentage of the guns sold are not even subject to a background check. In fact, right now, as we sit here, about 41% of guns being sold in America are not subject to a background check. That's how criminals get guns, more often than not. And in the case of Connecticut, what we see is guns being purchased in places like Virginia and the Carolinas and Florida. A lot of guns being purchased at gun shows, which has a loophole with respect to background checks. People bringing those guns into states that have stricter laws and then selling them on the street. And what we really need is, and what you're part of, is a national movement. If every state had the laws that Connecticut has, or New York has, or Massachusetts has, then we would have much lower death rates, much lower shooting rates. And in fact, we have some of of the lowest death shooting rates in the country, but it would be substantially lower if other states or the federal government would adopt our laws. That's what I advocate.
I appreciate the governor's perspective on the policy. I actually want to respond to it from a student perspective. And, you know, what gets my attention is exactly the very activities that you're engaging in, right? So your leadership, but in order for that to happen, there have to be conditions in school put in place for that to happen. So that has to be part of the curriculum. How is it that we engage our students around their civic duty and responsibility? How is it that we are allowing our students to experience and learn how to be informed consumers? Do you know what that is? When you go to a store, you want to make sure that you learn as much as you can about your product because you're going to make an investment. It's the same thing about policy. Make sure that you're informed consumers so you understand how the policies became about, the historical context, and then how it is that we have to change if that's necessary. And so what you are doing, not only the experiences that you're having as a learner, but then how you're transferring that and applying it to the real world, in this case around gun reform. And so I would say continue to advocate, continue to engage the adults, and in a few years from now, what I listen to is the fact that you all are going to be in a very different space. You all are going to be voting. You all are going to then be in our higher education institutions, and you are going to be in a position to influence policy at a very direct level.
Yeah, you know, I didn't answer that portion of the question, and I owe you an answer. I think all of the things that you mentioned are ways to make sure your voice is heard, and I agree with the superintendent that as voters, when that happens, then you're, by the way, anyone here 17? Okay. Have you registered to vote yet? Okay, because if you haven't, you'll miss the if you're 17 and your birthday is before Election Day in November, so you'll be 18 by that time, you'll have the right to vote in Republican or Democratic primaries if you become a voter. And primaries are pretty darn important. So becoming a voter, and quite frankly, becoming a voter who cares about gun laws. The NRA, National Rifle Association, is very powerful in making their voters a single issue voter. Now, I don't think that that's a good idea. I think there are other things that you should make judgments on. But when someone is not willing to make you or your children in the future safer, then that's something that you should use in making that judgment. So everything you're doing, I think, is empowering and putting pressure on folks to do it. You're just doing it in a state that is ahead of the game when it comes to its control of guns, and is advocating what you're advocating, a national solution.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Alejandro Figueroa, and I'm an 8th grader here at HMTCA. With the push for new legislation that is both tighter and stricter, what do you think needs to pass in the state of Connecticut that would further ensure school safety, and who has the right to register and carry a firearm?
I'll take the first stab at that. Again, we outlawed, after Sandy Hook in 2013, we outlawed any new possession or ownership of semi-automatic long guns. So they're no longer sold in our state, nor can they any longer be possessed unless they were possessed on the day when that legislation became effective. Personally, I would have favored outlawing the guns and requiring people to eliminate them from their ownership, but that wouldn't pass and didn't pass, and would have prevented some of the things that we did to have better laws in that particular package. I think it's very important that we outlaw guns being sold in parts. So that's the ability to buy a part of a gun and in parts and assemble it yourself. And I think it's very important that we this year do that in Connecticut, and that we also eliminate the mechanisms that allow semi-automatics to turn into automatics. And what does that mean? At the shooting in Las Vegas, from a hotel room on people who were attending a concert, bullets were flying at 90 bullets per 10 seconds. And you can do a lot of damage in a very short period of time, as was shown that day.
As a strong advocate for people of color, it pains me not to see this much attention nationally given to my community when our people are hurt by gun violence. Why is it that your skin color defines if the mass shooting is an act of mental illness or if you're just a cold-blooded killer or a gangbanger or a thug? What are you, the superintendent and the governor, doing to change the perspective of the people who you can influence on this matter?
Yeah, I think, thank you for raising the issue. I think race is an issue in America to this very day. I think that there continue to be all kinds of forms of discrimination. For instance, just recently, 2 individuals being arrested at a Starbucks because they were sitting waiting for someone. I don't think that would have happened to 2 white guys. I think that's the reality. And I think we get too comfortable with the idea that we've made so much progress we don't need to make more progress. I've heard lots of people say some version of that. Now, they're all white. They weren't Hispanic or they weren't black, but I have heard people say that. Well, we've done enough, or we've gone as far as we can go. And this is what I will say to you. You're going to change that. Young people meaning your age, younger and older, in college and beyond, a little bit beyond, have a very different view of race than we do. I'll give you a for instance. When I was growing up, you would never see a couple on TV that was multiracial. And now if you see an ad on TV, it's very frequently a couple that's multiracial because you're very comfortable with it. But people my age and older weren't or aren't. That's changing. And you have to keep talking about this. And I have to keep talking about this as someone who's advocated that kind of change. But I will say this, that there are many people, white people, Caucasian, who simply don't understand what you're dealing with on a daily basis. And they also don't understand the trauma that's created by that. I hope I do. And I've devoted much of my life in government to try to address that issue. That's by hiring people, by passing laws, by trying to reflect different behaviors. But it's an important issue that you all, meaning everybody in this room, need to keep raising.
So, I'll acknowledge and express gratitude for the governor's comments and his own personal views on this very important issue around race. As a woman of color, not only have I witnessed, but certainly have been victim, right, of disparaging treatment because of my race or gender. And so I'm very well aware. And the fact that I now am in a leadership position, it is my responsibility, not only morally because I believe in it, but because I know that at the school sites, we have to now, as adults, take responsibility to create conditions to have those very conversations that the governor was speaking about, to understand from a perspective of a person of color, from a perspective of someone that's older, younger, what those various experiences are, so that when we see those interactions at play, we're able to identify them and we're able to intervene in order for us to change the culture and the climate, not only in our schools, but of course in our broader society. So we all have ownership of changing the culture, but that can't happen unless we're brave to create conditions for those conversations to happen.
I just want to take this discussion, which is very, very important, a step further. Everything I've said about race also applies to gay, lesbian, transgender individuals. This is another group of people that have historically been discriminated against, causing its own traumas and its own difficulties. And so when we think about difference, we should think about how everyone is different from one another, and that difference is important, and that somebody identifies in a different gender than they were born to, or loves someone of the same sex. We just have to have these ongoing dialogues so that we understand who we are and what we are, and respect it. And so it is race, but it's other things as well. Disabilities. I grew up with disabilities are also another area. We just got to do a better job as human beings. We just got to treat people better than we do.
Thank you, Governor and Superintendent, for sharing your thoughts and listening to our opinions and ideas, and also giving us information on the laws out there and what's being done now. Maggie, would you like to add something? No?
Go ahead. For you? Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, just have this here.
What do I have next?
Time for one.
Okay. Go ahead.
So does someone in the audience have a question for the governor or superintendent?
Hi, my name is Malloy. I'm a junior here at HMTCA. So my question is just thinking, police brutality, like the Parkland shooting, is an example of a nationwide abuse of firearms. In 2018 alone, police killed 332 people, 59% of which were not white. Police rarely face significant penalties for their crimes. How can elected officials ensure police violence is condemned both socially and legally?
Again, it's a great question. I'm going to tell you something that you might find hard to believe, but until relatively recently, you could be a police officer in the state of Missouri with as little as 40 hours of training. States have got to train people better. That training needs to be on an ongoing basis. It needs to also include an ongoing discussion about race, that police officers, security personnel, everyone needs to be involved. And I'll say quite clearly, the police officers that were called to that Starbucks and made that arrest should have known better. And that didn't happen in the Deep South. That happened rather close to where we are. We should expect more of our police officers. We should hold them to the highest standards, and we should train them on an ongoing basis about things that may be confusing or difficult for them to handle. Having said that, there are states that have done a better job, and I'm proud that in the last few years we have passed additional laws requiring additional training with respect to that. And then the final point I'd make is we need better statistics in every town, every city, and every state in the nation, so that we can objectively analyze those statistics and point out when a police department has a disproportionate number of people of color who are being stopped for infractions as opposed to a white population, or who the gun is used or taken out of its holster against, or how someone uses a taser and under what circumstances. So this has got to be an ongoing dialogue, and I do have to go now. But it's a great question, and we should keep asking it. And even when we think we resolved it, we should keep asking it. Okay?
Thank you,
Thank you very much.
The superintendent can answer 2 questions from the audience, and then we have
So 2 more
just
questions.
2 more questions.
Hi, my name is McKenna Lindsay, and I'm a junior at HMTCA. My question is actually very similar to Larnay's. It is, what is our local and state government doing to enforce gun control? And why aren't brown and black victims of gun violence in Hartford receiving the same media coverage as the victims of school shootings? And specifically, why do school shootings have so much coverage when the victims are primarily white students? And why does it take a school shooting to occur to have this conversation about gun control?
it is unfortunate to, have a tragedy spark this level of attention and dialogue around how to change and improve. I can't speak to why from a larger government perspective. What I can speak to is the responsibility, again, that we have to raise awareness around that very disparate response that you're alluding to. The fact that, people of color are dying every single day, right? Multiple shootings throughout our nation, particularly in our most disenfranchised, poorest communities. And so that certainly hasn't risen to the level of scrutiny and attention that it warrants, that it deserves. And so I think it goes back to the conversation around value and making sure that we all understand that whether it is a school shooting or a shooting down the street, that people are impacted by it.
One more question.
Hi, my name is Randy and I'm a sophomore. So as you mentioned earlier, you were talking about how there's a lot of gun violence throughout the country. And so a lot of people are favoring the ban of assault weapon. But I made some research and I found out that most murders committed in the US are committed using handguns. Do you have a separate plan to address that issue?
Do I have a separate plan to address
The handgun issue.
So I don't have a plan to address handgun issue at a broader scale. Within my role as superintendent is to make sure that we continue to empower our staff, all of our staff, with the knowledge that is necessary to create safe environments. And what I mean by safe environments, yes, we want to make sure that we have the first responders. We want to make sure that our men and women in blue are ready to respond if there's an intruder, if there's someone that is bearing an arm that might be a victim of harm. And safe environments for the students that feel like there might be no way out, right? That they need support emotionally and mentally. So safe environments, it's something that belongs to all of us and to you as students as well. Making sure that you have connections to at least one adult in every school, so that if there is something that is upsetting you, that is bothering, that you've noticed in someone else, that you can identify that one adult that you can go see.
Thank you, Dr. Torres. Okay, guys. So after today, the NRA is going to go, phew, thank God that's over. The politicians that work with the NRA are going to be so relieved. So what we need to do is we need to take what we've learned from today and move forward with it. And we need to keep asking questions. Keep asking questions and take your solutions and make sure that it doesn't stop today. Because they want us to forget. They want us to forget these shootings. They do want us to forget. So again, please, I'm glad that you all came, and take these suggestions and these answers and do something with it. Thank you.
Students, you can head back to class. Thank you all for coming today and being a part of this discussion.